So Paul, I mean, in this context, when you say, "Are you a boomer or a doomer?" I know it's popular when somebody says they're a boomer. If somebody comes up and says, "Shut up, boomer," but
Yeah, okay, boomer.
Okay, I'm the boomer in the group, but go
I know
ahead.
you're talking here in terms of optimistic or dreading what the future can be. And what I would point out, and I'd just give the summer's blockbuster movie of Oppenheimer, is this was a race for technology and progress. And we saw that if we were first to the atomic bomb, now nuclear bomb, we could end the war.
This is Paul Johnson with the Optimistic American. I'm back today with Governor Ducey and Professor Henry Thompson. We're going to be talking about international issues. We're going to put a big focus on Henry Kissinger, China, authoritarian governments, and we're also going to put a focus on what's going on with Taiwan's chips and the executive order on AI technology and boomers versus doomers. I think you'll enjoy the show. It's a great conversation amongst the three of us. Thanks for joining us. Paul Johnson with the Optimistic American. All right, I'd like to welcome Governor Ducey as well as Professor Henry Thompson. Welcome back to the show, guys, and should be a fun day today.
Good to be back.
Thank you very much for having us, Paul.
All right, so the big news this week that I think we might start with was the passing of Henry Kissinger. Now, here's what I find to be interesting about Henry Kissinger. You know, Henry obviously was the national security advisor for President Nixon, as well as Secretary of State at the same time. That's really never happened in the past. But one of the big roles that Henry played was the opening up of China to the United States. At the time, you know, since 1947, most of the infrastructure of the rest of the world had been destroyed by the war, with the exception of the United States. But what happened is that as we ended up in this really tough Cold War with the Soviet Union, Henry was looking for a way to wedge against them. There actually was a very famous spy that gave information to the Nixon White House. He literally worked for the Kremlin, wasn't happy with what he saw that was happening with the Soviet Union. And we gained this information that there was a division between China and the United States. So Henry went out and found a way to cut a deal with the Chinese to bring them in to the American order. Now, it's not lost, I think, on most people that they made huge advancements since then. They went from about a 2.5% growth under Mao to what was about a 9% growth every year thereafter. However, what we're seeing now from Xi is some radical changes that seem to be taking place where he's tackling the world order. So the first question I'm just going to ask to both of you was, I think when we look back on Henry Kissinger's life, are we going to see him as a huge success? Or is this going to be one of the areas that the fact that he brought China in and gave them that much growth, and now they seem to be an adversary of ours, where we're going to look back at some of the things he did as being problematic? I'd love just your all thoughts on that.
Take it away.
Henry, I'll start with you.
Oh, okay, I can start. Thanks, Paul. I think that Kissinger is going to be remembered as someone who sought order through a balance of power, something that during his time even wasn't very fashionable or trendy, right? We're all taught that international relations, we should seek order through institutions, right? The United States was building institutions in the post-Cold War era, like the World Trade Organization or the GATT and the IMF and the United Nations. But Kissinger was trying to find order in international relations through a balance of power. And that's what he was trying to do by dividing the Soviets from the Chinese, and to try and really bring Chinese power into international relations, into the international system on the side of the US instead of the side of the USSR. And so I think that Kissinger will always be remembered as a very problematic figure for many reasons, but not least because he challenged this kind of liberal notion of order through institutions and international relations and really emphasized power politics. Now, he made a deal by bringing China into the international system on the side of the United States, and some might argue that that had profound consequences for the rise of China, but I would actually argue that the rise of China occurred predominantly because of domestic political reforms and not because of the reintegration of China into, or the integration of China into the US-led world order. So I think that Kissinger made a good decision to split the communist bloc, to hamper the power of the Soviet Union by bringing China onto the US side. And I think that it was really the market-based reforms in China under Deng Xiaoping that led to the economic and military rise of China, not really Kissinger making overtures to them in the late 60s, early 1970s. So I think that Kissinger will be viewed as a problematic figure for many ways, but I think that criticizing him for that reason is a little unfair.
Just a comment on that. So I agree with you. The reforms that took place by Deng were the capitalistic reforms that allowed the market to begin to blossom was the biggest thing that happened in China. I'm not sure that Deng did that voluntarily. I think a lot of that was beginning to take place without him, and he just moved ahead of the curve. But don't you think that their ability to sell product to the United States ended up being a contributor to that? And that was something that Henry played a role in.
Certainly, but that really only took off much later. The Sino-Soviet split already began in the 50s with Khrushchev's secret speech against Stalin, which Mao saw as a threat to his own personal rule in China. And the reforms under Deng Xiaoping started in the sort of the early to mid 1970s. And the real opening of the Chinese economy to the world economy only really started in the 1990s. And you could even say in the 2000s when they joined the World Trade Organization. So if you look at the trade volumes, they're really pretty minimal. So I think that there was a lot of growth to be wrung out of the Chinese domestic economy by allowing market mechanisms to allow for more efficient allocation of resources, for farmers to be able to keep more of their own produce, etc. And I don't think that initial growth takeoff was really the result of Kissinger's visit to China, unless, of course, there was some sort of indirect mechanism by which the liberal faction within the CCP became more powerful, and Deng Xiaoping was allowed to rise because of Kissinger's overtures to China and the perspective of an integration with the United States and the capitalist world. That's a possibility that there's a sort of an indirect mechanism, which I think could have lessons for today. But I think that the domestic reforms were the primary mover there with the rise of China.
Doug, any comments?
Well, I think it's a mixed bag of things. I think you can say that Henry Kissinger lived a great American life. You can say he has an incredible life story, beginning with his escape from tyranny in his country of his birth. I think if anything, it's a story of longevity. I mean, I think of the first president I can remember in grade school was Richard Nixon, and Kissinger was right by his side and his right hand. And then 50 plus years later, he's eulogizing John McCain in the National Cathedral, and I'm sitting there as governor. And even after that, he's been to China to meet with Xi. So I think the opening of China is getting a revisionist history look right now. At the time, the way I understand it, it was to separate the communist world and to open up markets to the United States. And I think we can find a lot of success in that. And I don't think we can blame Henry Kissinger for that. After all, that was Richard Nixon, who was the president at the time, and it was Kissinger who presented the opportunity. I think it's then been presidents since that have managed or mismanaged the Chinese relationship. I think naturally, as Westerners, we think that people will liberalize and embrace our ideas and values. That certainly has not happened in China. We are aware of that now today more than ever, and it creates a great power rivalry of our time. And then lastly, I think the most interesting thing about Kissinger's life is he was excellent at managing the Cold War. And he advised presidents along the way who wanted to manage the Cold War, what we used to call detente. And then, as I was coming of age, Ronald Reagan was elected, and he had no interest in managing the Cold War. He intended to win it, and win it he did. And I think there are lessons for leaders and historians going forward through seeing that in what seemed to be a very short period of time in a magical American moment.
I think there's a fair argument that in 1960s during the period of time that Kissinger was there, late 1960s, early 1970s, the United States had some challenges. Certainly, we had just ended the Vietnam War. There were major divisions that existed at home locally. We had financially some issues that we were trying to work our way through. And I think that there's an argument that says that had Ronald Reagan come about in the 1970s, he wouldn't have been as successful, that maybe Henry's actions were able to delay the problem long enough by creating divisions within communism that the 1980s were possible. And I think that's a fair argument. I don't know if any of you have listened or read much of Neil Ferguson, who talks a lot about Henry Kissinger. He's writing probably one of the definitive 2 books on his life. But Neil also said that Henry has made the comment to him that, before he passed, that he sees that where we are in the United States today is in a new Cold War with China. In fact, the way Neil Ferguson explains it is he says that when he first started meeting with him, he said that they were in the foothills of a Cold War. And then he said they were in the mountain passes. And he said in his last meetings with him, he said, this is, in fact, a new Cold War with China. But the logic to why you would define it as being a Cold War is to make certain that Americans understand it. Now, the current administration denies that there is any Cold War going on, that that's not what's taking place. But yet, the last 2 administrations have been pretty aggressive on taking actions that have begun to put divisions between us and China. Thoughts on that, Henry?
I do think that as a rhetorical device to get people's attention, describing it as a Cold War certainly is going to have a big effect on the American body politic. But when you look at what Kissinger did by bringing China into the fold, it was kind of audacious at the time, right, for an American president to reach out to China in this way, for the high-ranking foreign policy officials like himself, and then for Nixon to actually visit China and to offer sort of trading relationships, etc., with China. But it's that, I think, carrot and stick type approach that was so effective. And I think that also bears lessons for today, right? If we are going to engage in this sort of great power rivalry with China, then the United States has to not only have a clear deterrent military threat against any sort of attacks from China or from related bad actors in the international system, but it also has to have a carrot. It has to have a attractive political economic system on the international level that countries can engage with and integrate with to their benefit. And that was what the United States could offer China at that time, and still can offer China and other developing countries as a huge consumer market, huge amount of possibilities to integrate into the world economy and become rich. And so I think that the Cold War is a good rhetorical device for explaining the sort of the magnitude of the challenge that we're engaged in with the rise of China. But it also can be a little one-dimensional, and we have to remember the way that Kissinger and other statesmen engaged with Cold War was really multifaceted and needed to be in order to be successful.
Doug, I know you. I see you as an expert, certainly in terms of what's happening within the Republican Party politically. It seems to me that there's this growing division that is happening on a variety of issues, but one of them is this idea of being an isolationist versus playing a leader in the world market. The America First movement seems to be gaining steam again amongst at least some Republicans, which is interesting because Charles Lindsay years ago, right before World War II, had a very similar type of movement.
If any of these groups, the British, the Jewish, or the administration, stops agitating for war, I believe there will be little danger of our involvement.
That's not to be critical of the group that's there. I think there's a valid policy discussion between what are the advantages to the U.S. to being an isolationist versus one that is deeply engaged in what's going on in the world. And I suspect that there's extremes on both sides as well. Any thoughts on that?
Sure. I mean, it wouldn't be the first time that the isolationist attraction was there for the Republican Party. And I think it's this idea, oftentimes I feel like it's an argument of bumper stickers and sayings, accusing neocons and forever wars. And I do think with the hindsight that we have today, we can see what some intervention has cost us and ways that we could do it better going forward. So I think the commander in chief, whoever they are, or the nominee, has to make the case for what our place will be in the world. I think the difference between the Cold War and the fall of the USSR in 1989, we were the world's sole superpower at the time. And people like Fukuyama were writing books, The End of History, and saying that freedom and free enterprise and democracy had won, and we'd live in this ever improving world going forward, and there would be this incredible peace dividend. And that, of course, has not come to pass. We've had 9/11, the consequences beyond that, and then the rise of China. The biggest difference I see between the new Cold War analogy and the old, and I forget who said it, but history doesn't repeat itself, but it does rhyme, is Russia, the USSR, had a aggressive expansionist posture at the time. We have a real relationship with China, although it's fraught at this time. But there's an incredible amount of trade that has happened, and goodwill from the past that's most recently been lost. So I think with diplomacy and communication, and also a projection of strength on our part, we can avoid major conflicts going forward. I imagine we're going to talk about Taiwan and semiconductors at some point. That's something, of course, that from America First standpoint is in our best interest economically. So I think the idea on the right now is to make the case for where we should be involved, to have more of a posture of not being so eager to getting involved and intervening, but understanding why it's in our best interest, or interest for peace in our time or our hemisphere. And I think a difference here is what we're seeing in Ukraine and what we're seeing in Israel. And I think you're seeing different parts of the party, both parties, really being challenged by where we intervene and to what degree.
Yeah, it is not lost, I think, on most people that we have a potential for a three-front war. Right? We have the dispute that's going on inside of the Ukraine today. We have what's going on in Iran, and it's possible that we end up having a conflict in Taiwan as well, or that maybe China takes advantage of that to push their Taiwan agenda. Henry, I will ask you this. I know that this committee on this Committee for American Strategic Posture has this belief that we now have these twin adversaries from a nuclear standpoint. How do you think the U.S. manages that? Certainly, this committee that John Kyle, which is somebody that at least Doug and I both know, he was a senator of Arizona. He's the vice chairman of that particular committee. He's spoken about how much in trouble we are in terms of, and actually the whole committee's report talks about how much trouble we're in terms of our ability to rebuild our nuclear arsenal, as well as our ability to make certain that we're stocked up on arms. It's almost the exact opposite of what we hear going on with this whole concept of, the industrial military complex is the problem. Their report basically is saying, no, they're not the problem. We're not engaging them the way that we need to make certain that the U.S. is in a strong on a strategic standpoint. I don't know if you looked at that report, but any thoughts on it?
I haven't read the report, but I did read Rob's article on it this week, which I thought was very interesting and insightful. I didn't know that committee was doing that work, but it's always worrying when you see these sorts of reports sort of suggesting that the United States deterrent in the nuclear realm is being eroded, right? If we go back to the 50s to Thomas Schelling and some of these really canonical pieces on foreign policy in the nuclear age, everything is based on deterrence, right? The idea that even if the United States is hit by a nuclear strike by another power, that it can always strike back. And that threat is credible, right? That it will strike back. And so, if the United States nuclear arsenal is in such bad shape, if it's not up to the best technological standards, then that can undermine the belief among adversaries that if they did, for whatever reason, strike the United States or one of its close allies with a nuclear weapon, that the United States would be able to respond in kind with overwhelming force, and that's extremely destabilizing in international relations. And another aspect of this that I don't think was covered in that report, at least not the piece that I read about it, is the international level, right? The idea that the agreements around non-proliferation have been eroding for years, especially with Putin and Russia. China has been significantly increasing its number of nuclear weapons and its technological abilities in the nuclear area, and we're seeing proliferation, or the barriers to proliferation of nuclear weapons, kind of eroding as well. So all those things don't paint a particularly pretty picture on the nuclear front, which is the first step in preventing any major escalation of conflict among the great powers between the United States, China, and Russia, which is very worrying for sure.
Doug?
I didn't read the report or the article, so I'm hesitant to be vocal here, but I think there are some things that are obvious. One is just the amount of munitions that are needed in Ukraine and the stress that we have right now in providing those, I think are highly concerning to me. You would think we would have stockpiles just for our own use, and anything that we were working with Ukraine or Israel would be supplementary, and that we'd be manufacturing alongside that. The comment that you brought up around deterrence, I think, has to do with the nuclear triad, and I think that should be a real discussion on the debate stage tomorrow night and in the presidential debate once we come to the fall of 2024. And then the Pentagon is a separate issue. I think you can talk about a concern with the military industrial complex, and it's this idea of just continual spending, a lack of accounting and auditing. And then where is the effectiveness and efficiency? What weapon systems and investments are we making versus what investments are necessary? I know there's been a lot of talk about our Navy, and I think sometimes we forget that it's been our naval power projected around the world that's made the most of the world available for trade peacefully, and that by and large, transport on the seas. We were talking a little bit earlier off camera about the Vikings. We could also talk about what the pirates did in yesteryear. But that really is rare in this day and age, because these transport ships can travel all over the world, and we've seen much of the world brought out of poverty and lifted out of poverty. But that still should not stop us from a discussion on how we have a more effective use of our defense dollars, so we are prepared at home and that our allies are prepared abroad when we do intend to partner and ally with them, work with them.
It's certainly, you can see the two faces of Xi. He came to San Francisco, and we saw this one face that talked about, hey, I don't plan to enter into a Cold War or a hot war with anyone. But you can also go back and listen to his inaugurational speech when he became president for life. I think that was his third inauguration, where he talked about completely redrawing the maps of the world, changing the maps of China, putting China into a position where the world begins to not only respect, but begin to adopt its values. He talked about why NATO and the strategic alliances that the United States have are incredibly problematic for them. And he saw the United States as being a regional power, not a world power, and wants to try to readjust the world to be able to do so. In my opinion, at the end of the day, this is a guy who is still a communist and an authoritarian. And I don't mean a communist in the McCarthy sense. I think they have a belief system that is about how world markets should work. And at the end of the day, it's hard for them to trust the open markets that Dung put into place. Henry, you put a lot of work into authoritarian governments. I'd love to just pick your brain on that one.
Yeah, the first thing I'd say about Xi Jinping is that we always like to think from the outside that dictators are very secure in their positions, right? You just said that Xi has declared himself dictator for life, and we think they therefore can make all sorts of decisions because they're not constrained by elections or public opinion. But most dictators don't feel that way at all. They are deeply paranoid because the rules governing who rules and who doesn't in dictatorships are very, very weak. They can be deposed by someone from the Politburo, a general from the military or the Air Force or something at any point in time, really. And for most dictators, they feel that very, very acutely. And so, what I would say about Xi Jinping's worldview is that his worldview, like every dictator, revolves first and foremost around staying in power, staying out of prison, and staying alive. And that means that he has to remain at the pinnacle of this communist party that he served in his entire career. And we know that in these sorts of systems, foreign policy changes can be very radical. Domestic policy changes can be very radical if they happen to fit the preferences of the dictator that's trying to stay in power, right? So if you think about Mao, who today we view as this sort of the personalist dictatorship, he had so much tremendous personal power. He launched the Cultural Revolution because he was paranoid that he was going to be deposed by his challengers within the party, right? And basically caused China to descend into a civil war simply to reduce the threat of his, or eliminate the threat of his rivals within the Politburo and within the broader party elite. So I would say that Xi Jinping probably feels the same. He feels he has to maintain his position in power at the top of the CCP. And at the moment, it very clearly seems that his position at the top of that party is promoted by presenting external threats as being very acute, by making national security the predominant issue, that he is promoting people closely around him with national security expertise. He's using that as leverage to create a very loyal party elite. But if times changed, and it became a different domestic political issue, or it became more advantageous for him to take a different stance in foreign policy, I think he could reverse course and take a completely different tack in foreign policy. So what I would say about Xi Jinping is always very difficult to tell what's going on at the top of these very closed authoritarian regimes. But the calculation is always relatively simple. It's how do I stay in power? They will People like Xi Jinping may have to change policies very quickly, turn on a dime if they need to keep their positions.
All right. So the next question I'm going to ask is to Doug, just because you've had a deep involvement with what has happened with TSMC. But before I do, give me just a minute to try to set this up, because I think that it's important. Henry Kissinger talked about a Cold War, and he talked about how to win one. How are you successful in one? Well, one of the things, or the things that we've talked about here today, which is their system's flawed. At the end of the day, if you give them enough time, they'll fail on their own. The idea that you can have a centrally run marketplace is almost always not going to do as well as a distributed marketplace where people have the freedom to be able to make choices. The second thing is have allies. Make certain that you're supporting your allies, that you are working to help make them stronger. The third one is do your best to avoid direct conflict, because direct conflicts can end up with a nuclear exchange. That has a problem all itself. But the biggest key, and the biggest key for Reagan and for us winning the Cold War, was our strategic advantage on technology. Now, I think it's not lost on anyone here that part of why China wants Taiwan is because of Taiwan's involvement in the semiconductor space, TSMC. One of the things that's become clear, I think, to most Americans is that while we have some great companies like Intel's and others, they're more focused on this N5 chip. The N5 chip is still the majority of chips that we end up using, but the N2 chip, the 2 nanometer chip, is the chip that is most important for both cell phones, wearable devices, and AI technology. Doug, you played a huge role at getting TSMC to be able to move into Arizona. If you can, let's talk about that for a little bit, about why you saw that as being important, what it is that you think that they do, and how it is that it positions us long term.
Well, I think you set it up real well, Paul. And I am proud of the record of the past 8 years as governor. But without a doubt, the biggest economic win that we had in Arizona was landing TSMC. I mean, every state in the nation wanted that project. And this may be the most important and most valuable company in the world right now. And all you have to do is drive north on the 17 up into to North Phoenix to see how it's transforming the state and the state's economy, and we'll benefit from this for decades. The other thing that was unique about this negotiation, there's Nikola and Lucid and other things that you can point to. But that's really a game between Doug Ducey and Ron DeSantis and Greg Abbott and Jared Polis. I mean, it's a competition among states. With TSMC, we had Mike Pompeo as Secretary of State, Wilbur Ross as Secretary of Commerce, and Mike Esper as Secretary of Defense involved in these negotiations. So it gives you an idea how consequential and superior Taiwan Semi's technology is to anyone else's in the world. So I think it's a great opportunity for Arizona. I think it's also something we can take further advantage of geopolitically. The real value in Taiwan, besides the people that are there and whatever resources, is the technology of Taiwan Semiconductor. And I think there's such an opportunity for a redundancy here in Arizona, which would serve as a deterrence to any aggression on the mainland's part. That's something I've socialized in Washington, D.C. and among our senators. But this is a technology that pervades everything that we do, from our phone to our car to our kitchen appliances. And the best company at this is right here in Arizona, right there in Taiwan. If you drive up north into North Phoenix and take a look at this project, they're building 5 fabs that are 667,000 square feet each. They're building 5 of these. And this is the first of 20 that are to be built here. To give you, it's hard to get your head around the size and scope and significance of this project. So this is a strategic advantage to Arizona and to the United States. And I think that there's more that can be done by our federal government, and you won't hear me say that very often, but national defense and diplomacy is their role to have further deterrence of aggression onto the island of Taiwan.
Yeah, it's to me, this whole issue. I'm not quite certain. Well, actually, there's a great book called Chip Wars. It does a great job of explaining how it is that we ended up in this position where we no longer control the dominant technology. And when you start looking at the EUV technology, which actually is, now getting down to being able to produce these chips, I think the information that was in the book was that today the chip is about half the size of a coronavirus. And you have to have lens technology and laser technology that can literally inscribe on something that small to put the transistors on it that make it work. And when you start getting down to that small of a device, we now have literally only one place in the world that's making over 95% of these chips, and it's out of Taiwan. Now, if we lost that position, it has a huge effect on missile guidance systems, on weaponry, on other military types of devices. We certainly, over a period of time, would be able to pick up the slack. But nonetheless, during that interim period of time, we'd be at a disadvantage. I think you're right. I think TSMC serves more than just an economic tool for Arizona. This is a strategic device. It's important to the security of the United States. Henry, any comments on that?
Let me say something a little contrarian, Paul, which actually kind of picks up on something that Governor Ducey said before, which is that I agree with everything you said about the importance of these high-tech devices and on the importance of computer chips, etc. But I would also point out that the war that's going on in Ukraine has devolved into a sort of a low-tech war where the ammunition that's being used, these artillery shells, this is not particularly technologically advanced. It just needs to be produced in huge quantities, right? The Russians and even the North Koreans seem to be very efficient at producing these sorts of weapons. And so I think we should always keep an eye on the unexpected, right? The idea that it might not be the super high tech guided missile or hypersonic missile technology that wins a confrontation with China or with Iran or with Russia and Ukraine, but that it might be, swarms of $50 drones or these handheld anti-tank missiles, handheld anti-aircraft missiles that are much simpler and cheaper to be produced, but they need to be produced in quantity. So I think that the United States can walk and chew gum at the same time, luckily. But I think that it's interesting. It's interesting to see this contrast right at the moment between the emphasis on TSMC on the one hand and on stockpiles of whatever 30-year-old artillery munitions sitting in South Korea on the other. I think that both of those things are really important in international relations and security at the moment, and it's kind of an interesting contrast.
Paul,
Well, and I think that
one of our
go ahead,
mutual
Doug.
friends who watches this podcast said that we don't have enough disagreement. We need to find some real left wingers to get into the mix here. But I think to Henry's point and to what I said earlier, it is a combination of these two things. And I think it's why you see this isolationist strain is pervading much of the discussion, because they don't see the effectiveness of our engagement. And how can we be talking about some of these high-tech things yet be out of munitions for someone that we would consider an ally or someone that we want to support? Somewhere something is wrong. And we began the pod by talking about Henry Kissinger, and I don't want to be one of these folks that I think right now is a time to honor his life and his accomplishments, which were great and many. But I think we also have to realize that he was at the shoulder of the president at the close, at the prosecution and the close of the Vietnam War, and also at the time of Watergate. And the erosion of trust in the federal government and in our institutions. I mean, you look at some of the Gallup polling from that time before Vietnam, and 70% of the country, I believe, had faith in the federal government and its leaders. Now, maybe that was too high of a trust that was projected, but I believe that we have earned this erosion of trust of so much that's happened from Vietnam to Watergate. Of course, we had the Reagan Revolution, which did much to bring the country together and move it forward. It's almost amazing to think somebody who was too extreme to win the nomination in 1976 deposes Jimmy Carter with 44 states in 1980, and then 49 states upon reelection in 1984. So, and the resulting collapse of the Soviet Union in 1989. So we've seen the United States at a pinnacle in our lifetime. We see right now real challenges ahead. And when you say the potential for a three-front war, you certainly do see that possibility. You see a world on fire right now, and a projection of weakness on fronts from our federal government, and it's highly concerning.
If I could weigh in again, Paul, I don't want to harp on, but I talked about the kind of low tech munitions being used in Ukraine. If we went back 20 years, I can't believe I'm saying it, but 20 years now to 9/11 and the ensuing conflicts in Afghanistan and Iraq. I mean, this also wasn't really high tech warfare. This was counterinsurgency, and people had to go back to look at the British experience in Malaya to try and learn from that, because they simply were not prepared for that kind of war. Right? The United States had been preparing for a land war in Europe. They'd fought Saddam Hussein using relatively high tech tank warfare in open territory. They weren't prepared for that type of counterinsurgency. So I think that when it comes to international security, you always have to keep one eye on just being open to the unexpected, right? It could be we are talking about a three-front war between with Iran slash Hamas, Russia, and China, but maybe it's North Korea invades South Korea. Maybe there's a state collapse in Central America. The United States has to get involved in Venezuela. Apparently, just had a referendum on invading a neighboring territory the other day. So I think that. Without saying that the TSMC investment is a bad thing or not, I think it's a great thing for Arizona and for the United States. But we should always be really attuned to our own ignorance and being aware of the potential for being surprised in international relations, international security.
Yeah, it seems to me that we're not going to be successful without both. I mean, the last thing we want to do is end up in a land war with Asia, that where we're slugging it out based upon how many men do both of you have versus how many bullets do you have. I don't think that we want to do that with Russia either. Those are the types of warfares that they're used to fighting. But you do need enough bullets, and you do need enough shells, and you do need the stock and the inventory to make certain that you can deal with the low tech portion of it. Controlling the high tech portion is as important as well. If we really, while we have been very helpful with Ukraine, and I think that much of their, you can't take away from their victory being hard spent by them and their own people. But American technology has definitely helped them, as well as the American munitions and European munitions that have been added to the fray. I think in looking back, one of the things that stands out to me, Doug, you mentioned this. There's an old saying that says that before Watergate, it was the age of Camelot. After Nixon, it became this age of Watergate, where everything was suspect. Everything was in question. But you can actually look at pieces during that period of time and recognize that there were periods of time where we actually did galvanize the public. That galvanization usually is when we had a very well-defined foreign enemy. And in saying a foreign enemy, that didn't mean that we had to necessarily be at war with them or be in a violent conflict with them. If you go back to John F. Kennedy, the space race between us and the Soviet Union galvanized the country. It brought together many of the different components. If you look at Ronald Reagan, you can see a galvanizing that took place in the United States because of a desire to win the Cold War. You can go to George Bush later on, and you can see the galvanizing that took place during 9/11. Now, certainly you don't want those events to happen, but it's just not lost on me that when you have a clear adversary on the other side, that America does end up uniting and they begin working towards a goal. I think the Cold War that we have with China, if the Cold War that we have with China means that we spend trillions of dollars improving our technology, there are two benefits. One is strategic and military, but the other one is the improvements that happen to the human condition. That all of those things end up having positive effects from a commercial standpoint that are very beneficial as well. And that to me is where this whole concept of technology, if for no other reason that we should be in a Cold War or a race with China, it is to make certain that we control that angle, because that angle is going to play a huge role both commercially as well as militarily.
Well, without a doubt, the advance in technology has made our lives more convenient. The quality of life, the wealth creation, the prosperity that we experience in this country and around the world, and it's one of our chief exports. But there was a question earlier, and you put me as a subject matter expert on the Republican Party, and you were talking a bit about isolationism. But Paul, it wasn't that long ago before our greatest ever historic victory in 1940 that we were isolationist here at home. And FDR was our president, and it was a shocking and surprise attack on the United States. December 7th, 1941. It's a date that all Americans have committed to memory, that brought us into the war. And we were not prepared, and we did not have the munitions or the Navy, but we saw the arsenal of democracy be organized, the magic of free enterprise, focused on a cause, and everything that happened. So I would say in this age today, if you want to call it isolationist, I can accept that to some degree, because I certainly think that mood is out there in America. But I want to point out something that to me was surprising. October 7th, what happened in Israel, I think it's very easy for us to condemn what Hamas did to the citizens of Israel. As governor, I had signed the Holocaust education bills and the definition of anti-Semitism and put out all the statements around anti-Semitism. And I knew it was an issue. I don't think that I had any idea, and this is also on top of 3 visits to Israel, the first in 2016 when they were calling it the Third Intifada. The depths of anti-Semitism that existed around the world and on our campuses in the United States, and the division that we're seeing between the Republican Party and the Democrat Party on this support of Israel versus this condemnation of Hamas. And I do think a discussion around Palestinian civilians is certainly something we can weave into this. But the events of October 7th and the resulting outcry and what we see in continuing protests and marches in some of our largest cities, I'd be curious as to what you and Henry think about that, and if you had the same sense of surprise as to the reaction.
Doug, I watched 4 years ago at Charlottesville the Proud Boys do their march with torchlit torches, talking about Jews will not replace us, right? And there were 1,000 men that were marching in that march. I would have never imagined in my wildest imagination that the left could try to match that. Now, when we saw the professor on the college campus talking about he was exhilarated by what it was that was happening inside of Israel, when we saw a congresswoman talking about from the river to the sea, which is basically about Jewish extermination, both sides have a problem. Now, we had a rabbi on the other day who talked about this, and I found it to be fascinating. He said that we talked about the idea that on the far right, they see it as a white genocide. On the far left, they just see the Jews as being part of white privilege, like they're being attacked from both sides. I do think it's important to point out that is not the average Republican, and that is not the average Democrat, and that is certainly not the average American. Americans are going to be sympathetic for pictures that they see on screen that are happening with Palestinian children. I think anyone would be. But I think most Americans are very pro-Israel. They see them as being attacked on October the 7th. They believe that it wasn't their fault. And it's not hard to see that, if you look at Hamas has received hundreds of billions of dollars. But there are 3 guys who live in Qatar that are worth $11 billion that are the head of Hamas. They're not even in Gaza, right? Where'd they get the money? Were they some technological expert, or did they invent something? No, they siphon money off the top. They've been ripping people off inside of Gaza. They've been creating an environment where it's very hostile to Jews because they want to try to remove them. And what they're constantly telling their people as a means to try to disclose their thievery and the money that they've stolen is, the reason that you're living like this is because of those people over there. That's not new in history. That happens over and over again. The challenge is we have to speak up on this. I think we have to speak up over and over again because the other side is going to speak up. Professor Thompson, I'd love to hear your input on it.
I would echo quite a lot of what you said. I don't think that your average college professor or student has been making radical statements, let alone anti-Semitic statements. I also don't think that even your average campus leftist would be comfortable being described as an anti-Semite. In fact, I'm absolutely certain they would be appalled at being described as that. I think that, but I also was not really surprised when I saw the very, very strong condemnation of Israel that sort of dallied with or slipped into anti-Semitism at its worst, right, in specific moments, because there has been, for many years, very strong condemnation of Israel on the left for some of the expansion of the settlements in contested areas in the West Bank. For example, there's been this boycott movement of Israel and companies that produce in Israel, wearing the sort of the Palestinian scarf has been a sort of a trendy thing to do on campuses among campus leftists for a very long time. And I think that kind of latent anti-Israel, I wouldn't necessarily call it anti-Semitism necessarily, but anti-Israel, anti-Israeli foreign policy or domestic policy stance then interacts with some of these other ideas that you mentioned about, sort of very simplistic racial divisions between people of color and whites, and they put the Israelis in the position of the privileged whites and the Palestinians in the position of the oppressed people of color, which of course is a massive oversimplification of the situation. And so I wasn't entirely surprised to see that at its worst, that this confluence of ideas could take on some pretty nasty anti-Semitic forms. I wasn't entirely surprised, personally.
I do think it's a chance for education. If you listen to the Jewish population, it's hard sometimes for people to understand why they see being anti-Semitic and anti-Israel as one and the same. That doesn't mean that they're not critical of things that Israel might do, but the point is, Israel came about in about 1948, and it was because of the Holocaust that had happened in Germany, and it became a place for them to go. By the way, designed by the United Nations or approved by the United Nations, the world said, here's the place for you to go where you'll have a place. Israel since then has brought in immigrants from...
It was not a random place. It was not a random place either.
No. And they then brought in Israel, have brought in Jews from all over the world that were being persecuted. My mother and father-in-law were persecuted in Iraq as Jews because Saddam Hussein and the Ba'ath Party was basically just a follow-up to what had happened with the Nazi Party. Overwhelmingly, you'll hear in Israel the stories from people again and again where had it not been for Israel, they would not have survived. It's so connected to their ability to survive that attacking it feels to the average Jewish person as if it is an attack against their ability to survive. Not just them, but their ability to even have been here. The truth is, it's the only place they have. If there are lots of other places we may be able to go as Americans, right? We may go to Canada, we may go to Europe. There are other places that we could look at. But if you're Jewish and you've been persecuted, and they have been over and again, this becomes so important to them that any type of condemnation ends up, they're sensitive to. But when you add to it that a group went out and killed 1,400 people, kidnapped another 300, murdered old women and children and raped women, it resembles all the things that they've seen in these other horrors that have existed around the world. I'm positive of this. If it were ISIS and it were against the United States, we would be doing the same thing Israel was doing. If it was Al-Qaeda and doing the same thing that had happened by Hamas to Israel, we'd be doing the same thing that Israel is doing. Israel is in a position where they have to eliminate this threat. And from my standpoint, thinking about the Palestinians, I think the Palestinians will never have a good life until we figure out some way to create a governmental structure that doesn't allow these authoritarians like Hamas to take place. Governor, I'll give you a last comment, and then we're going to pivot to AI technology.
I just think much of the discussion on the left has been around proportionality, and I think it's the wrong subject and the wrong discussion. There was no talk of proportionality with the United States after December 7th. We intended to win that war, and Israel intends to win this war against Hamas. And that is when you can have peace. It seems like the international community will not allow Israel to win its wars. It's allowed to prosecute it to a certain degree, and then the folks from the United Nations say it's time to take your foot off the gas. And I think you see that with the Biden administration to some degree, although they have been supportive. There was that tweet that went out, I think, on October 8th or 9th from Anthony Blinken calling for a ceasefire that was since deleted. I think Israel has every intention of defeating Hamas. I think we should be supportive of that. And that is the best chance for peace with the Palestinian people, is to get rid of Hamas first and foremost. And then I think these types of discussions and negotiations can happen after that. And then the concern along the way, to Henry's point, is you don't know what you don't know. And yet we know Hezbollah is on that northern border. And anything could happen in Israel right now. This is not solely reduced just to the southern part of Gaza at this moment.
All right. So I'm going to flip to AI technology for a moment. And I'm going to flip to it because I'm very irritated by Joe Biden's executive order on artificial intelligence. And I'd love to hear both of your guys' opinions on this. Certainly, Doug, knowing the committee that you're running, I'd love to know how you feel about it. Here's my stand on it. Software has been one of the great unregulated industries in the United States. And there's no coincidence that software is one of the areas where the greatest technological advancements have taken place, because it is unregulated, because the free market has a chance to be able to work. Joe Biden has put into place a AI executive order. That executive order has been lauded, to be fair, by many of the different technological groups who are the large players that are saying, hey, this is a good thing and that it's needed. Now, my challenge to it, the first one is they have over 4 different entities, governmental entities, that are going to be a part of the regulation. It has all types of ambiguous reporting requirements that are not understandable. By the time they get done, they're going to end up creating a new governmental organization, as sure as I'm standing here, because I've just watched this happen too many times. And in the process, they're going to kill the small guy, the person who's trying to compete with the Google or the Facebook or the X, the group that's trying to come in and find a new way to create a better mousetrap, because they won't be able to live within that regulatory environment. We just got done talking about warfare and the importance of having the technological edge, recognizing Henry's comment that we also need to control the low-tech edge. If we're going to control it, it is the wrong approach to be creating new regulations this early in the game. I mean, from machine learning, we're only 2 to 3 years into this, and trying to create some type of standard when even the industry doesn't know what the correct common standard should be, to me seems to be an impossibility. I'd love both your input on it.
Ducey knows more about this than me, so I'll defer to you for a start.
I don't know that I have expertise, although I am and was a businessman, and I've certainly dealt with governments. And I think this regulation, this executive order at the infancy of a new technology, is a huge mistake. And I think, Paul, you could not only talk about software, but you could talk about computers and the cloud and the internet. Much of it is all gone unregulated. And yes, we can point to some problems, but I think we would also see an incredible amount of successes. We've seen the rise of Silicon Valley and a complete transformation in our economy. And the federal government had very little to do with it. You could give the Department of Defense and DARPA some credit for the beginning. And I also think when you talk about AI, it's undefined at this time. So whether that's Siri or Alexa or the self-driving, my Siri just turned on, or the self-driving of Tesla, these are also iterations of AI. So basically, they've written an executive order that they can begin to implement right now on everything that exists. And had a heavy-handed administration had this order earlier, you'd still see IBM as a dominant company. And the people that are lauding this and begging for regulation are the incumbents. and the titans. I mean, there's a reason Mark Zuckerberg is saying, please regulate us. Because he's one of the richest men in the world, and Meta and Facebook have such market share, and there will not be an innovation or an outsider to disrupt them with regulation. So I think this is something that's highly concerning. All that's there right now is the words on a printed page, but I think we need to make people aware, and that this should be a discussion in the election cycle on how we do roll this back, while at the same time have the appropriate oversight. But it certainly is not from bureaucrats in the federal government, who, if you remember those hearings that they had when they were trying to break up Microsoft, these were guys that didn't even know how to turn on their computer, that were interrogating Bill Gates at the time. So I think it's a mistake and it's a problem, but it's still fixable.
You know, the corruption issue is, when you look at the corruption issue in democracies, one of the big types of corruption is called regulatory capture. It's this concept that we go create regulations with large industries that create a protection for them, and through that protection, they're able to keep the small guys out. There was a study done that I found to be fascinating. We talked about it in one of our past episodes with Elliot Pollock. But if you look at Bill Gates added about 2 to 3% to the national GDP. His economic equivalence in Mexico is Carlos Slim. Now, what Carlos Slim did is he figured out how to get the government to limit anyone else from being able to have the cell phone industry other than him. Now, he built up a similar amount of wealth to Bill Gates, but it actually had a negative impact on the economy. Regulatory capture is not only something that's corrupt, it stops the best technology from being able to move forward, the best mousetrap from being able to move forward. I've seen, Doug, I know you have, I know as mayor, I saw lots of regulation, lots of people who advocated for regulation. In general, when I saw people advocating for it, it was incumbents trying to keep other people out of their space.
We did a study on how many regulations there are in Arizona. And even with the talented staff that I had in the governor's office and the position as chief executive of the government, it took about 18 months to actually call all the regulations together in one place. And there was 11,000 plus. And what we wanted to do was eliminate and remove any regulation that didn't protect public health or public safety. We wanted to measure twice and only cut once, but we were able to remove or eliminate 3,000 plus regulations. This was the equivalent of a $189 million tax cut every year to the general fund without the removal of $1. And I imagine that there's more that could be done. And certainly when you look at the size of the Federal Register, what the Biden administration has added in just 3 short years on top of what was an effort to remove regulation at the federal level under the Trump-Pence administration, there's all kinds of opportunities for improvement here. And when free enterprise does what only free enterprise can do, it solves a lot of issues that the government is not equipped to address. So I think you pointed out something with regulatory capture. And if we can put in the show notes, if anyone's seen Bill Gurley's presentation at the All In podcast, talking about his experience and how he learned about regulatory capture. I think it's 24 minutes and it's a master class that speaks to everyone, whether they're in business or not, as to why these things are not good and stifle advancement and progress.
All right, so I'm going to ask you both a question. Sam Altman got sacked from OpenAI. We all know about that. It was infamous. His board sacked him. I always found it interesting that he had this not-for-profit organization that had worked with the for-profit side, bringing in Microsoft, that ended up buying 49% for $1 billion, but they were capped at the amount of money that they could make. It was an ingenious structure. I'm not quite sure why the not-for-profit was in there, other than trying to make certain that he had some buffer from being maybe the first trillionaire in our country, because that's an industry and that's a company that clearly could be. But he gets sacked. After he gets sacked, Microsoft picks him up. They're willing to hire 700 of OpenAI's employees, and then OpenAI ends up getting religion, and they bring him back in, which, by the way, one of the guests on our show has been Larry Summers. Larry Summers ends up going in and being one of his board members. But if you look at this, here's what's fascinating. It's really an argument between what they call the boomers and the doomers. Right? The doomers are the group of people who they see this technology, and I think rightfully, they're worried where this technology may go, what it may do to privacy, what it may do to the human condition, and maybe even creating something that becomes beyond our control as human beings. The other side, the boomers, I think they recognize those risks exist, but they believe that the only way that you really overcome them is to make certain that the good guys are as empowered as the bad guys. And the bad guys can be people who work in a black market or who work in a market offshore. They believe the way that we move human progress forward is by empowering them to the nth degree. Now, if you're a boomer, you are not going to like the AI executive order. I see myself as a boomer. I'd love to know how you guys qualify yourself, one or the other, or somewhere in between. Henry, you first.
I think I'm somewhere in between for the simple reason that I'm a little dubious about claims that a certain technology is going to destroy the world, because I always see them as similarly what we were just discussing, as vested interests trying to protect themselves, and people who are afraid, right? When you saw the first steam-powered threshing machines and tractors and things being brought in the 19th century, you had the Luddites who would go out and smash them up and smash up the first mills that were producing textiles and things in Britain, because they thought that if they didn't have jobs in agriculture and they didn't have jobs doing weaving, that they'd starve and there'd be no other jobs for them. Of course, that's not what happened at all. That was just the very beginning of the most incredible surge in human prosperity and human history. And so I'm a little bit dubious about people who want to stop technological progress, both because I think there's a lot of fear there and people worried about losing the existing positions that they have without thinking about the progress that's going to come from technology, and also because of vested interests. Now, AI is such a broadly applicable technology. It's essentially universally applicable, and it is conceivable that with enough computing power that it could become autonomous and start changing things like our electricity grid or taking control of the nuclear arsenal, things like that. It's sort of impossible to imagine all the possibilities that AI could be used for. I think we just have to have some sort of faith that those worst possible outcomes won't come about, potentially because AI will also be used to prevent those sorts of things from happening. And so, yeah, I'm a boomer. I'm a boomer with some fear of potential catastrophic risk, I guess, is where I would come down on this.
Doug.
So Paul, I mean, in this context, when you say, are you a boomer or a doomer? I know it's popular when somebody says they're a boomer, somebody comes up and says, shut up, boomer. But
yeah, okay, boomer.
Okay, I'm the boomer in the group, but go
I
ahead.
know you're talking here in terms of optimistic or dreading what the future can be. And what I would point out, and I'd just give the Summers blockbuster movie of Oppenheimer, is this was a race for technology and progress. And we saw that if we were first to the atomic bomb, now nuclear bomb, we could end the war. And we were not a superpower at that moment. We became the America we've grown up in after that. And had Germany gotten to that nuclear bomb or atomic bomb first, all of Western civilization would be different than what we know today, if not existing at all. So what I would say on AI is you cannot unring this bell. This infancy of technology exists. And either the good guys are going to lead on this and find where they need to harness it and control it and put up guardrails, or there will be bad guys out there that want to hurt or harm us or do destructive things with us. God forbid a Hamas or an Iran or a North Korea would lead on this technology. So I think we are in a race again. I think we've led on technology from the technology of national defense to the technology of convenience, and the fact that we're all in three separate areas and talking to each other in real time and having it recorded, and you're going to have it streaming on the internet at lightning speed. That's the real challenge here, and that doesn't mean that there won't be some regulation or things that need to be addressed. And I think very smart people that do not behave as incumbents but are some of the greatest innovators of our time, like Elon Musk, have expressed concern around this. I just don't know how we put the toothpaste back in the tube right now. I don't see that as an option. So we have to work to make it work for us and to the benefit of our country, our people, and then hopefully for peace and prosperity around the world. There's a lot of opportunities around productivity with it. That's to be certain.
So I think you just mentioned the example that works. If you look at what Joe Biden's executive order did, it comes from a doomer mentality. It comes from a mentality of saying, hey, this is going to be a huge problem. The effects of this could be catastrophic on human beings. You talked about Oppenheimer and the Los Alamos project. That was taking people from the industry and focusing on how it was that we could harness those powers to accomplish something greater. Now, you can create whole types of arguments, I understand, and analogies about that. But the point is this: instead of creating an executive order to limit them and to regulate them, candidly, with people who I am highly doubtful have any understanding of what it is that they're going to be regulating, but instead brought together the people from the industry that said, America has a specific purpose. We need to make certain that we win this war without harming human liberties. You bring together a Los Alamos type project with the best people. You mentioned Elon Musk. There are many others who are in that space. I think you'd find them not only willing to participate, but we'd be able to come out with something that was moving us forward as opposed to trying to hold us back. Henry, any comments?
My response to that is that the Manhattan Project was about solving a very specific goal using a very specific technology, creating a nuclear bomb using this new physics that had been developed at the time. But AI is a universally applicable technology. It's not clear if we brought Elon Musk and Mark Zuckerberg and all these people together and said, go, it's not entirely clear what we'd be asking them to do, right? And I think that's part of the issue with AI that's going to make it so difficult to regulate, is that it can be used for anything, and you can do it on your personal computer. I mean, you can download the requisite coding packages onto your laptop and just have at it and create AI models. I mean, there are workshops here at ASU for our undergrads about how to create AI models. Do people really think they can stop people from doing this? So I'm a little bit skeptical about any centralized effort to control or regulate AI for practical reasons. Maybe what I would hope is that there be some sort of decentralized mechanism for combating the potential worst effects of AI, right? That you have an industry around encryption and data protection, anti-hacking, etc., that uses AI technology to combat other AI technologies, and that grows up in an organic way through private enterprise. I think that's our only hope for this technology to be extremely widely used, which is its main benefit, right? That processes across the economy can be automated and made very efficient at very low cost in all aspects of the economy, but that also these potential bad effects of AI can be combated. And I'm dubious of any centralized attempt to control that or direct that in any way. I think there will always be bad actors that get around it, and it might just not be possible.
All right. So I'm going to turn now to the what we're going to call the optimistic corner. At the end of every one of our shows, I'm going to put together just a little segment where we talk about things that we see that are going well, and where we try to point out reasons for optimism. Here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to share with you 3 slides today that I think help give us an understanding of what really is happening in the world. Now, this first slide that I'm putting up is the share of population in extreme poverty and the drop that's happened from 1981 to 2019. You can see that around the world, poverty has been dropping. And, when you start looking at the reasons as to why, I think you're not going to find that government was the one that did this. In fact, the United Nations, during the time I was mayor, they did a challenge. And the challenge was that by 1995, they wanted to drop poverty in half. Not only did we drop it in half by 1995, we actually exceeded the standards. We're seeing a continual drop. The reasons for that, I think it's just undeniable that it's a free marketplace at work where we're seeing technological improvements that are improving the lot of mankind. The idea that you can be in sub-Saharan Africa and you can have a cell phone and you can do business on that cell phone to buy and sell things dramatically changes the way that our world market works. The next slide is a slide of the number of child deaths. Now, look at the number from 1990, again, just 30 years ago to today. It was over 12 million child deaths that happened in the 1990s, down to 5 million today. And then finally, child mortality. If you look at child mortality from the 1800s to today, the share of children that are dying, it's dramatically dropped. Now, I could have put up, and I will put up in future shows, what's happening in literacy rates, what's happening in educational rates, what's happening in hunger. Overwhelmingly, you're seeing improvement that is happening around the world. In the next show, we're going to do one that actually is going to talk about inequality. At the end of the show, I'm going to show you some slides that show you how inequality is actually not getting bigger, how it's actually dropping. We're seeing improvements even in the United States. There are many, many reasons for us to be optimistic, but I think that we lose it. Whether you're on the right or on the left, one of the strongest things that our government ever did is it empowered the individual over itself. And by doing that, Doug talked about this a moment ago, as did Henry, Professor Thompson. The idea that we empowered the private sector gave us the ability to deal with many of these problems around the world in a way in which that's greater than what government could do for us through its collective means. I'll let Professor Henry and Doug have the last comment, but again, I just wanted to share a little bit of optimistic news.
I like these graphs. Shout out to my former colleague, Max Rosa. When I was a postdoc at the University of Oxford in England, he was my colleague there, and he started this website, Our World in Data, and I use these slides in my classes a lot. I just would make one comment. I could make so many different comments about these sorts of statistics. Part of this story, at least in the last 30, 40 years, is the rise of China. We talked about at the start of the show, and lifting, hundreds of millions of people out of poverty in China. And the Chinese Communist Party likes to claim credit for that. But the reality is that it's the least communist part of China that has created that increase in wealth. It's the parts of the Chinese economy, the Chinese political system that are the least communist, that have the most Western influence, that have the most market incentives, that have the most individual freedoms. It's the liberalization of agricultural markets, the creating of trading enclaves where they allowed for manufactured goods to be traded with the West along the East Coast. Those are the things that allowed for that tremendous increase in wealth and broad-based prosperity in China, despite the claims of the Chinese Communist Party that they are responsible for that. That would be my one comment on those slides. And I look forward to commenting more on similar slides next week and in the future.
Governor?
Thank you, Paul, and thank you for pointing out some of the good news that's happening out there. I think sometimes we can dwell on all the serious issues, both domestically and around the world, that we have to deal with. And we know this is a more troubling time than other times in our lifetime. I'd also think just completing Thanksgiving, which is my favorite holiday. We have much to be grateful for, and you put 3 slides up that we can be grateful for. And free enterprise, freedom and free enterprise are a result of all of the movement of those numbers and the progress that we have. And 20 days from now, we celebrate Christmas, and in my faith tradition, that is a day of birth and light and renewal. And we saw a world transformed in 33 short years with one man who in my faith we would call the savior, to bring these ideas that it's not necessarily Rome or might that makes right, but there's a better way in which to live. So I think there's a lot to be hopeful for. We've seen trying times before, and in this season, if we can't be optimistic about what's next, then we're going to have a really tough 2024. So I appreciate you pointing that out, and I think with the holidays here, there's much to celebrate and see what's what matters and what's most important.
Yeah, I think the unification of all those comments that both you made, the governor and the professor, is we're here to renew the human spirit. And we believe that the human spirit can do amazing things. In fact, throughout history, regardless of oppressive governments, it's been able to do so. But when government allowed them to operate in a way in which they could be as most fruitful as possible, we've made incredible advancements. I'd like to thank both of you for being here. Happy holidays to everyone else. This is Paul Johnson. Thank you very much. Thanks for joining the Optimistic American Show. Help us grow by subscribing to our channel. If you enjoyed the episode, please leave a like and a comment. There is so much more that we have planned. We can't wait for you to embark upon this journey with us.